The first time someone said she was too old for any man, she just nodded and went back to stacking her firewood like the words had slid right off her bones. But the second time, when it was said by the new preacher's wife in front of half the congregation at the summer potluck, she turned and looked the woman in the eyes and said nothing, just looked, calm as pond ice, until the woman shifted and fidgeted and finally muttered some excuse to tend to the corn cakes. Her name was Clara Gaspar, 62, widow for 17 years, no children, no family, no debts, no obligations, and as far as the town was concerned, no place in a world that had moved on without her. She lived a mile north of Bitter Hollow, past the mule trail, and up the limestone rise where the bluffs caved inward, and it was in one of those caves, half-chiseled, half-natured, that she made her home. They'd always called it odd, some called it a tomb, some said she must be half coyote, living like that, sleeping under a slab of rock like a hibernating bear, but nobody cared enough to look past their own chimneys, not until the freeze came. But that was months off, when the leaves were still green, and the men still chopping trees for barns, and the children still barefoot in the dust. Clara was just the old woman in the cliff. She walked with a long switch instead of a cane, had shoulders like chopped wood, and a mouth that hadn't smiled in a decade. She didn't take handouts, didn't gossip, didn't praise the Lord out loud like she used to, and she didn't show her face in town unless she needed salt or to trade dried mushrooms. The truth was, most folks forgot she existed, or maybe they preferred it that way, because Clara Gaspar was a reminder of what a woman might become if she didn't marry, or if her husband died, or if the world just moved on and left her standing alone at the edge of it. But if you followed her home, if you braved the rocky trail where the ridges opened like broken teeth and the cold rose early from the shadowed gorges, you'd find something different. Not a hut, not a proper house, not even what you'd call a cabin, though there was timber in the doorway and shingles nailed into the stone slope. You'd find a half structure jutting out from the bluff, fitted into a hollow like it was meant to be there. The back half of her home was the cave itself, dark and dry and sunken deep, while the front half, with its sod roof and thick chimney and narrow windows, held warmth like a sealed clay jug. Inside, it was tighter than a cellar but cleaner than most kitchens. A clay stove sat sunk into the stone wall, surrounded by a narrow trench filled with river pebbles that warmed slow and stayed hot through the night. The back corner had shelves stacked with root vegetables and moss-packed jars of dried meats, a deep bed pressed against the stone, raised on a frame of split logs insulated with turf and fleece, and there was a vent, low, hidden behind a wall panel that Clara had dug herself over 10 winters ago. It drew in air, heated it along a run of rocks buried beneath the floor, and vented it gently back out. She never explained it, never wrote it down, just tested it one winter after another until it worked. All of it was hers, built by her, forgotten by the town, but remembered by the wind, the frost, the foxes, and the few old-timers who still knew how to survive without a dry goods store. That summer, though, no one gave her a second glance. They were too busy preparing for what they thought would be a mild winter. The signs were off. The elk were still lingering in the higher passes, and the streams hadn't iced in years this early. But Clara knew better. She felt it in her knees, her teeth, the way the moss dried too fast on her north wall. Something was wrong. She spoke once, just once, during the town council's late September meeting, when she walked in uninvited and stood silent in the back corner, while men argued about trapping permits and timber allowances. When the room quieted, she said, "If you got children, get your chimneys cleaned before November. Stack 3 cords, not 2, and if your floorboards have gaps, plug them now. It's coming." Then she left. That was it. No explanation, no story, just a warning. They laughed about it, called her Widow Groundhog, said she'd been up in that cave too long, breathing her own smoke and counting ghost tracks. But the frost came early. By the second week of October, horses began dying from colic. By the third, the river froze shallow and solid. When the first blizzard hit in early November, it buried the last of the potatoes still in the ground and cracked half the wagons left under tarps. Roofs started groaning by the end of the week, and for the first time in 20 years, the snow didn't melt between storms. The men called it an anomaly. The women called it a punishment. The children just cried and huddled in bed because the cold was coming through the walls, through the floorboards, through every seam and nail and crevice in their cabins like invisible claws. By December, 2 cabins had burned down from chimney fires. 1 man froze to death trying to walk 2 miles for medicine. 3 families ran out of wood before the solstice. And that's when they remembered Clara. Not all at once, not like some miracle, just murmurs, questions, guesses. Didn't she live up in that bluff? She's got a stove sunk into stone, right? Didn't she say something at the council? That's when a father named Briggs, the same man who once said Clara was as useless as a rusted horseshoe, took his wife and 3 children and trudged up the trail to her door. He didn't expect much, a locked door maybe, or nothing at all. But what he found was warmth, and a woman who looked at his frostbitten child, opened her door wider, and said only, "Take off your boots, dry them here." She didn't ask why he came, she didn't scold, she just cleared a space near the stove, handed him a blanket sewn from muslin and rabbit pelt, and poured broth from a kettle so thick with steam it nearly made the man cry. Briggs was the first, but by January there were 24 people living in and around Clara's cave. They built lean-tos against the bluff wall, dug out trenches under tarps, stacked firewood in a ring around the slope to block the wind, and each night families rotated through Clara's half-cabin, warming their feet, feeding their babies, sharing stories in hushed voices. And every night, she was there, stirring the pot, adding more stones to the trench, tending the small internal fire that somehow never went out. She was not soft, she didn't cradle or coddle, but she never turned anyone away. And when a mother named Delia gave birth during the worst storm of February, while wind howled like a banshee down from the pass, Clara knelt beside her and helped catch the child, wrap it, and place it against the mother's chest without flinching once. That baby would be the only one born alive that winter. And as for Clara, she never once said, "I told you so." She just kept boiling water, feeding the stove, tightening the shutters, and sleeping less than 4 hours a night so others could take her bed. But something was happening that no one noticed yet, not even Clara. It wasn't just survival, it was the beginning of something no one in Bitter Hollow had seen in years, something that would change everything if the thaw came in time. It was around the second week of February, after the third ice storm in 5 days, when the snow stopped being white. That was the week the wind turned sharp enough to slice open the side of a cow, the week you could hear nails groaning out of wood and the bark popping off trees like gunshots, when every fence post snapped off at the frost line, and the creek vanished entirely under a sheet of ice, so thick it caught the hooves of deer and held them in place like statues. It was no longer a winter the townsfolk understood. It wasn't even the sort of weather folks had stories for anymore. It was older than that, something meaner, deeper, colder than memory. That was also the week the old schoolhouse roof caved in. No one had been inside. The children hadn't gathered there since before New Year's, but the sight of that collapsed roof, shattered beams like broken ribs, shingles scattered across the drift like leaves, sent something tight through the hearts of everyone in Bitter Hollow. It was more than just a building falling, it was a piece of the town, undone. And that was when the fourth family hiked up to Clara's cave. This time it wasn't a desperate man or a frostbit child. It was the Burrows family, 5 strong-bodied folk who'd always kept to themselves, folks who'd once claimed that a woman without land was no better than a stray dog. Now, they were dragging a sled with all they had left, bundled in rags, with eyes wide from smoke damage after their chimney flue reversed and filled the cabin with soot. They didn't knock, just stood there in the snow like ghosts. Clara saw them through the small slit of her window, leaned her elbow on the rough-sawn ledge, and took her time. A slow sip from her cup, a glance at the fire. Then she opened the door, not all the way, just enough to let out a wave of heat and broth and the scent of salted pork. "Strip the kids first," she said. Not a greeting, not a curse, just instructions. They obeyed. Inside, it was barely passable anymore. 40 people, if you counted the ones tucked under tarps and lean-tos outside. Inside, maybe a dozen each night rotated through to sleep on warm stone floors, rubbing hands over calloused skin, passing mugs and broth and breathing each other's breath to stay alive. The stove never stopped. Clara's pebbled trench, lined with flat shale and blackened iron, never cooled. When others slept, Clara boiled. When they woke, she stirred. And when they begged her to rest, she'd grunt and slap her knees and say, "I didn't come this far to freeze in my own bed." But it was clear she was thinning, her cheeks drawn tighter, her arms still strong but her legs showing a tremble she hadn't had in November. And still, no one offered to replace her. Not really. They offered to help, which meant stirring a pot or chopping wood or wiping down the inside of the entrance flaps. But no one else knew the stove. No one else knew the path of the airflow tunnel buried in the earth beneath them. No one knew how the vent system reversed its draw depending on temperature. No one knew how the clay tiles she'd molded and baked and embedded under the floor held the heat better than stone. And no one dared rearrange the structure she'd laid down years ago with nothing but her own hands, instinct, and trial by survival. Clara was the stove, and the stove was the heart. But even hearts can break. The storm came on February 17th. No warning, no wind, just a drop in pressure so sudden that grown men felt the blood rush from their ears. The clouds dropped low, heavy as anvils, and then the temperature fell until boiling water thrown into the air landed back as ice. This time, it wasn't just about staying warm, it was about not suffocating. The vents in every home in Bitter Hollow froze shut, ice-clogged chimneys, windows frosted on the inside and stayed that way. Babies cried, but the sound didn't carry, and for the first time, even the mayor's house, newly built, triple-insulated, lined with imported bricks, began to crumble. One by one they fled. All night they came, stumbling, wrapped in curtains, dragging sacks of grain or nothing at all. One man carried his wife on his back, both of them barefoot, wrapped in a flag. A mother carried her twin boys under her coat, both unconscious, their lips blue and eyes open, but unfocused. And Clara, she didn't ask names, didn't ask why they waited so long. She just opened the inner flap, waved them to the trench and said, "Feet first, keep breathing, don't talk." Someone that night said, "She's like a general, like she's been fighting this freeze for 20 years. But it wasn't until 3 in the morning, when the winds started howling again, that Clara made a decision. She pulled Briggs aside, the man who'd come first, who'd quietly begun keeping order when things got too crowded. He had a voice people listened to, and he didn't argue when told to do the dirty work. She handed him a bundle wrapped in hide and whispered instructions. He asked her 3 times if she was sure. She didn't answer once, just nodded and turned back to the trench. The next morning, while the wind still screamed and visibility was near zero, Briggs and 2 others dug into the snowbank near the south wall and uncovered the old pit Clara had warned them never to touch. Inside was a secondary intake, an emergency draw vent that, if opened too soon, could kill the stove's circulation system. But it was the only option now. With the sheer number of bodies and the way the frost was sealing the outer vents, they had no choice. When they opened it, the cave roared. Heat shot through the floor like a wave, followed by a gust of cold that pulled the air down so hard it knocked 2 children off their feet. The fire danced madly, the stones hissed, and then, miraculously, the temperature stabilized. For the next 2 days, the cave was the only truly warm place within 10 miles. And during those 2 days, Clara never left the stove. She sat, wrapped in layers, back hunched, eyes half closed, hand on the clay flue lever, adjusting the air as needed, even as her lips cracked and bled, and her breath came short. By the second morning, folks realized she wasn't sleeping. Someone tried to bring her broth. She waved it off. Someone tried to massage her feet. She growled and pulled them away. And then came the collapse. Not of the cave, not of the bluff, but of Clara herself. She didn't fall dramatically, didn't cry out. She just slumped against the stove, eyes still open, hand still resting on the lever, like she'd fused into the system she'd built. Briggs caught her, laid her down, and for a moment no one breathed, but she stirred, just enough to whisper, "Don't touch the second vent unless you feel it in your teeth." They had no idea what it meant, but they listened. Briggs stayed by her side. He rotated the vent lever, tested the trench stones, learned the pressure of the chimney flue with his own hands. By the 4th night, he understood the basics. By the 5th, Clara stopped moving entirely, still breathing, but asleep now, fully. They built a cot for her near the stove, lined it with hot stones, wrapped her in all the hides they could find. Delia nursed her with broth from a cloth. The children whispered stories they thought she'd like, and the stove never went out. Even as February ended and March brought one more surprise blizzard, the heart of the cave stayed hot. The people of Bitter Hollow didn't just survive, they began rebuilding. Lean-tos turned into stone-lined shelters. Snow mounds were carved into domes with inner fire pits. Someone mimicked Clara's trench system using metal scraps and heated sand. For the first time, survival became learning, not just suffering. And every night, someone sat by Clara's side and kept the fire going the way she had. She never woke that week, but her hands would twitch at the sound of shifting logs. Her nose would wrinkle when someone opened the flap too wide. Her mouth would move soundlessly when someone forgot to rotate the vent. Briggs swore she was training them even now, and maybe she was, because by the time the final frost lifted and the first meltwater began to trickle down the bluff, Bitter Hollow had already changed. The mayor resigned. The church opened its cellar. The schoolhouse was rebuilt using stone instead of planks, with a trench stove inspired by Clara's layout. And that spring, when the wildflowers returned and the wind smelled of mud instead of ice, the townsfolk held a vote. They didn't tell Clara about it. She was still recovering, her body stiff as roots, her voice not yet returned. But the vote was unanimous. And when they told her that the town was naming the new hearth hall after her, she simply closed her eyes, shook her head once, and said, "No need for names. Just teach the children how to build it right." The thaw came like a man waking from a long, violent fever, slow, coughing, uncertain. It didn't announce itself with sunshine or blue skies, just a loosening of the frost, a shift in the air, a silence between the gusts of wind. The snow didn't melt. It sank, like a body folding in on itself. The icicles vanished one morning without dripping. The deer tracks that had vanished months before reappeared overnight, brittle and narrow in the softening snow. And Clara Gaspar, who had not spoken a full sentence in nearly 2 weeks, finally opened her eyes. Her throat made no sound at first, just a dry rasp, like a fire gone to ash. But her hand moved, reaching for something not there, and when she saw a face she recognized, Delia, cradling the infant she'd helped bring into the world, she nodded. "You didn't let it die," she whispered. Delia, eyes full, just shook her head. "No," she said, "we didn't." The cave cabin had held. More than that, it had become the cornerstone of the town's survival. 43 souls had slept beneath its roof, and another 30 more had been rotated through each day to warm their limbs, cook meals, and stave off frostbite. Children played in the dry end of the cavern now, their laughter echoing off the walls like life returning. Women were boiling linen to make proper bandages. Men were carving sled runners and boiling pitch to seal up broken roofs. Even now, in the early tremble of spring, they were planning ahead. Briggs had taken to walking the bluff each morning with a slate and charcoal, drawing diagrams of Clara's stove layout, sketching the airflow paths, calculating insulation depths and thermal retention, like a man who'd discovered scripture in stone. "She wrote the book," he'd tell anyone who asked. "I'm just trying to copy the pages before time eats them." No one laughed anymore when he said things like that. By the middle of March, the passable trail to the valley opened, and a few younger men rode out to find supplies. But most stayed. Bitter Hollow had shrunk to the slope of a single cave, but its heart had grown larger than ever. Still, something unspoken lay in the air like the last layer of frost. Everyone knew the miracle had come with a cost. Clara hadn't stood in weeks. She took broth, but little else. Her hands moved less each day. Her voice, while returning, was a faint echo of itself. And though she never once asked to be left alone, she also never asked anyone to stay close. She had done what she came to do. That was written all over her face. But the town wasn't done with her yet. Briggs, on his 3rd morning walk that March, came to her with a bundle wrapped in muslin. Inside were papers, drawings, notes, guesses, all based on her stove. He laid them in her lap, kneeling beside her bed like a child presenting a carved stick to a parent. "Don't have your mind," he said, "but I've got hands. If I do it wrong, you tell me." She looked them over in silence. Then she tapped one diagram with a cracked finger. "Stone paths too straight. Heat'll run too fast. Bend it. Force the heat to linger." He smiled like a boy caught cheating and nodded. By the next week, he'd dug a test trench outside the cave with the exact bend she described. It worked. Heated the air slower, yes, but held the warmth longer, steadier. More sketches followed. Other men copied them. Clara oversaw each, sometimes only with a glance, sometimes with a full correction. She didn't have the strength to draw, but her eyes caught every mistake, and still she didn't leave the cave. Even as families began moving back to what was left of their cabins, even as wagons rolled in from the south bringing new salt, flour, boots, and letters from forgotten kin, even as the first council meeting of the new year was held in the open meadow under the thawing sky, Clara remained inside. At first they thought she was still too weak, but it wasn't that. She was waiting for the one thing no one else in Bitter Hollow had the patience or the pain to sit still long enough to feel the final frost. It always came late, after the first burst of melt, after the gulls returned and the rivers cracked open and the bark began to swell. It was a holdover from the deep earth, a whisper from below, and Clara, who had lived inside stone, felt it rise from the soil itself. When it came, 3 days after the first full sun, she was ready. She woke before the others, stepped out of the cave before dawn. No one saw her leave, but they found her tracks, barefoot, pressed deep into the frost-covered moss, leading up to the ridge where the sun first touched the valley. She stood there, hands clasped behind her back, chin lifted, watching. When Briggs found her, he didn't speak, just stood beside her. The silence between them was full. She nodded toward the town below, cabins with blackened roofs, plumes of smoke twisting from the few working chimneys, children's clothes strung like flags from fence posts to dry. In the far field, 3 men were unloading beams from a cart to begin building something new. "They'll forget," she said softly. "Not for a while," Briggs answered. "They always forget. That's what people do." He looked at her. "And what about you? You leaving?" She gave him a long glance. "I never left." He meant to ask what she wanted next, what she needed, but the words didn't come, and she wouldn't have answered anyway. That night she called a gathering. No fanfare, no church bell, just a slow word passed through the camp. "Clara's asking for us." They came, not knowing what for. 50, maybe more, packed into the mouth of the cave. Lanterns flickered against the walls, casting long shadows behind every man and woman, boy and girl. Clara stood, wrapped in her old wolf-hide coat, a red scarf tied around her throat. Her voice, when it came, was steady, not loud, not dramatic, just sure. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "Not your names, not a title, not a plaque or a hall or a library of stoves named Gaspar." Someone chuckled. Someone else wept. "I didn't build this place to be remembered. I built it to live." She paused, looked around the crowd. "But if you must remember something, if your children ask one day what saved us, don't say me. Say this: a cabin in stone will outlast the wind. A stove sunk deep will burn long. And a woman who works the earth with both hands don't need anyone's permission to survive." She turned, walked back into the dark, and no one followed. From that night forward, the town began to change, not with shouts or proclamations, but with quiet acts. Root cellars were dug deeper, stoves sunk into stone rather than balanced on planks. Airflow vents became standard, tested each fall by fire and smoke. Each house, by council decree, was required to maintain a backup shelter within 2 miles. Some built theirs in old gullies, some repurposed caves. One was even carved beneath the chapel. They called them Clara holes at first, half joking, half respectful, then just shelters. The name faded, the structure remained, and as spring warmed into summer and the green came roaring back over the hills, Clara's cave emptied. One family at a time, always with a handshake, a gift, a meal, but never goodbye. She never said goodbye. She just nodded and returned to her stove. Some said she'd die there. Others believed she'd vanish into the rock like some ancient spirit. But Clara Gaspard did neither. She stayed. She chopped her own wood. She fixed her own vent. She dried mushrooms, repaired her boots, taught Delia's boy how to trap squirrels with a snare made of bent willow. And when she could walk strong again, she hiked into the South Ridge and came back with a new iron pot on her back and a story about a trader who owed her a favor from 15 years ago. She never talked about the winter, not in detail. If someone asked, she'd shrug. "We did what needed doing," that was all, but the rest of the town remembered it in other ways. When the new schoolhouse opened that fall, its stove sat in the center of the room, surrounded by stone, built into the floor. The teacher explained to the students how it worked, using diagrams copied from Briggs's slate. At the end, a girl raised her hand and asked who built the first one. The teacher paused, then said, "A woman up on the bluff. Is she still there?" The teacher smiled. "She is." That girl would grow up and build her own cave cabin 20 miles west, in a place that didn't even have a name yet. And one day, during a flood, 21 people would survive because of it. But Clara would never hear that story. She had already begun the next chapter of her own. By the time the second winter came, no one dared go unprepared. They called it the Year of the Cave in Bitter Hollow. Children learned about it before they learned to write cursive. Folks no longer argued over whether to listen to the older voices, the quieter ones, the stranger ones. Clara Gaspard's cave had reshaped not just the physical survival of the town, but its soul. Yet Clara didn't sit on a porch telling stories. She didn't hold court, didn't take visitors unless they came with a reason. The cave was hers still, tight, quiet, warm, and untouched except for the shelves now heavier with dried goods, the trench stove deeper and wider, and the new venting lever Briggs had installed under her direction. Clara had lived her life being overlooked, then briefly held up like some lantern during the storm. And now, like all things real and reliable, she was fading quietly back into the stonework of the town's memory. But what most didn't realize was that Clara was watching. She saw the way people rushed when they didn't need to, the way men still thought loud words equaled leadership, the way women apologized for knowing things. She watched children scrape their knees, trying to copy the wrong examples. She watched boys become boastful and girls become silent, and she didn't like it. She said as much to Briggs one day, as they sat near the entrance watching the red gold maple leaves fall in the early days of October. "They're surviving," Briggs offered. "Ain't that the point? Surviving isn't enough," Clara muttered. "They're building roofs without sealing the walls, running to dig before checking which way the water flows. We saved them once, but that won't last." Briggs nodded but didn't answer. Clara looked at him. "How long you been watching that ridge?" He blinked. "Which ridge?" "The one behind the chapel, where the snow always gathers first." Briggs squinted. "Don't think I've looked," Clara grunted. "Then you missed the signs. Snowline dropped 2 weeks earlier this year. Wind's wrong, and the deer are already heading low. You saying it's coming again?" "I'm saying it never left." Briggs didn't argue after that. They began warning the town quietly, not shouting, not stirring panic, just sharing what Clara knew and letting folks draw their own conclusions. But this time, no one laughed. No one rolled their eyes or called her names. They listened, they checked their stoves, they measured their wood, and this time, they built deeper. 3 families reinforced their cellar floors with stone slabs. One man tore out his entire fireplace and rebuilt it after Clara inspected it and said, "This won't draw heat, it'll chew it." A group of women formed a new committee, not to plan parties or bake sales, but to inspect homes for heat efficiency and help widows or single men plug drafts. They used old canvas dipped in wax, stuffed deer fur in the walls, cobbled together new stoves from scraps and blueprints based on Clara's designs. Still, there was tension, because now the town remembered just how bad it could get. And remembering meant fear, and fear made people start asking things Clara didn't like. What if it's worse this time? What if she can't keep us warm again? What if she dies? They never said it to her face, but it found its way back. Words always do. And so Clara made a decision. That November, when the first frost came and turned the grass to glass, Clara walked into town for the first time in 10 months. She didn't go to church. She didn't go to the council hall. She went to the new schoolhouse. It was midday, sun barely lifting behind thin clouds, and the children were still indoors. The teacher, Miss Amara, blinked when Clara stepped in. Some of the younger children didn't even recognize her. She waited until they fell silent. Then she said, "Today I'm going to teach you how to listen to stone." And they listened. She drew in the dirt with a stick. She used the iron stove as example, the floor as metaphor, the wind as measurement. She showed them how to test air currents with a candle flame, how to feel the heat of a stone, and guess how long it would hold. She talked of weight, depth, shape, slope, not as abstract science, but as a mother talks about tending her child. You don't control fire, she said. You court it. You prepare its home. If you do it right, it stays. If you don't, it leaves. The children didn't fidget once, and by the time she was done, she turned to Miss Amara and said, "You teach them this every year. Before you teach them letters, before you teach them numbers. You teach them how to survive." Miss Amara nodded, and Clara left. The snow came early that year. Not a blizzard, just a steady creep of white that layered and packed and didn't melt. People were ready. Fires lit early. Stoves stayed warm, root cellars stayed full, but what no one expected was the sickness. It began in the eastern cabin ring. A boy named Eli came down with chills that wouldn't break, followed by coughing fits that echoed through the night. Then his mother, then his sister. It wasn't cholera, it wasn't consumption, it was something slow, suffocating, spreading like smoke through the tightest homes. Within a week, a dozen people were coughing, not dying, not yet, but close. Clara didn't wait to be asked. She packed her satchel with boiled pine, dried mullein, cedar bark, powdered onion, and sage. She walked through the snow like she had somewhere to be, and she did. She went from cabin to cabin, not with commands, but with instructions. Steam this over the fire. Inhale twice a day. Move your bedding off the floor. The cold rises. Don't burn wet wood. You're feeding the mold. Some listened, some argued, some cried. She ignored all that, and still the cold deepened. One night, a mother named Ruth knocked on Clara's cave with her infant wrapped in a shawl. "I did everything you said," she whispered, voice tight with fear. "But he won't stop shaking." Clara took the child. She didn't coo, didn't whisper comforts. She pressed his tiny chest to her own and said, "Bring me your floorboard." "What?" "Bring me a loose board, now." Ruth obeyed. Clara peeled back the board and stuffed the hollow with warmed stones, lined with a wool cloth soaked in pine sap water. She laid the child in that cavity, sealed it, and waited. By morning, the child was sweating gently, fever broken. Ruth wept. Clara handed her a small bundle of dried herbs and said, "Now teach the others." It spread like that. Her knowledge, her instinct, her fire-worn wisdom, not from council mandates or sermons, but from woman to woman, grandfather to grandson, neighbor to neighbor, a ripple that couldn't be seen until it reached everyone. The illness slowed, the fire stayed lit, and Clara began to sleep again. Not long and not deep, but enough. One morning she rose to find Briggs already boiling water at her trench. He handed her a mug and said, "You're not the only one who knows how to make it breathe now." She smiled, just slightly. "Don't make it a habit." But the truth was, she'd been waiting for someone to say that, because she knew, always had known, that she couldn't live forever, and what she'd built wasn't a legacy. It wasn't even hers anymore. It was a fire passed from hand to hand, a language written in stone and heat and instinct, a kind of love that didn't need to speak its name. By the third winter, Clara Gaspar's name wasn't just remembered, it was spoken with a kind of hush. Not reverence exactly, and never pity, but something like a scar you carried with quiet pride, something that burned a little when you touched it. Her cave had become less a place and more a blueprint etched into the bones of Bitter Hollow. It wasn't that folks worshipped her. They didn't bring her gifts or try to make her mayor. That would have been a fool's errand. It was subtler, more dangerous in some ways. They began to believe she would always be there, because people, even in the harshest places, slip easily into comfort when the sting fades. They start to believe that because one old woman survived the impossible once, she'll survive it again, that her cave will always be warm, that her mind will always be sharp, that her door will always creak open when the smoke turns black or the river freezes mid-flow. But Clara knew better, and when that third winter began to press its weight on the land, she felt it differently. She felt it in the way her fingers wouldn't close right around the axe handle, in the way her breath caught on mornings when she stooped too low to stoke the trench stones, in the way her dreams now spoke to her in voices from years gone. Her husband, her brother, her mother whispering things in tones she couldn't repeat aloud. She didn't say goodbye, not to anyone, but she began preparing. She taught Delia's boy how to clean the stove without smothering it. She let Briggs make a full map of the airflow system, not just the stove, but the side vents, the moisture runoff channel, the hidden exhaust valve near the stone shelf where she stored the pine gum. She gathered the children again in the schoolhouse, not with drawings this time, but with questions. How would you heat a shelter without stone? What do you do when smoke won't rise? What's the fastest way to make a trench hold warmth? And then she just listened. When one girl answered wrong, she didn't correct her. She turned to another and waited. That winter came hard and late, like a drunk uncle showing up after dark, slamming the door behind him and knocking over every chair. It started with freezing fog, air so thick and cold it pulled nails from boards. Then came the river cracking in the middle of the night, sending up geysers of steam that froze mid-air. Then wind, then silence. The kind of silence that makes dogs whimper and makes strong men ask questions they'd buried long ago. Clara stayed in her cave. She didn't invite anyone in this time, not because she wouldn't, but because she knew they wouldn't need to ask. They'd built their own, not as deep, not as perfect, but good enough. One by one, cabins stayed standing, fires stayed lit, children stayed warm, and still some came, not because they needed shelter, but because they needed her. By the third week of the freeze, Briggs knocked on her frame and entered to find her sitting beside the stove, staring at nothing, both hands folded in her lap. "I came to check the trench stones," he said. She nodded. "They're holding better this year," he added, kneeling to test one. "We doubled the insulation, used your bend technique. The airflow's smooth." She didn't reply. He reached into the firebox, adjusted a lever, checked the drawer. Then he noticed the stew pot was empty. "Have you eaten today?" She looked at him. Her voice was dry. "Not hungry." Briggs sat beside her. "It's working, Clara. Everything you built, it's working." She nodded once. "I just came to say, we don't need you anymore. Not the same way." Her eyes didn't flinch. "I don't mean that wrong," he rushed to add. "I mean, we finally learned." Her mouth curled, just slightly. "Then it was worth it." Briggs stood. The trench stones hissed quietly. The cave breathed. He turned to leave, then paused. "If you ever want to move into town?" "No." He waited. Clara looked up at him, and her voice was clear this time. "This is where I stay, where I belong." And so she did. The freeze broke weeks later, slowly, like everything else in that country. People emerged into a world still grey, still brittle, but alive. The town didn't throw a festival, didn't hold a parade, but they did one thing. One morning, every household that had survived the storm lit a lantern and placed it outside their door, not on a post, not in the center of town. They lined the road leading up to Clara's cave, dozens of lanterns burning against the mist, flickering in the morning frost. Clara saw them from her ledge. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She just stood there, arms crossed, eyes full, the wind tugging gently at her shawl. And when the sun finally broke over the ridge and struck the first lantern, just one flicker of gold lighting the path, she whispered to herself. They remembered. It would be the last winter she'd see. But the warmth she built, that stayed. They taught it to their children. They carved it into stone. They passed it on. And when someone, years later, asked where it all began, they pointed to the bluff, to the cave, to the place built by the woman no man wanted. And they said, that's where she lit the fire that never went out.